We have a special guest. You don't want to miss this episode. State Representative Vicki Lopez, a Miami Republican who has quite the backstory. You want to listen to it. It includes time in prison and a presidential pardon and oh so much more. Stick with us for a deeper dive with State Rep Vicki Lopez.
I could either take the Martha Stewart approach and just go back to living my life and being happy that I'm no longer, in the system, or I could say to myself, Vicki, there's got to be something you continue to do and say.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by City and State, Florida.
Thank you for listening. We're back with Representative Vicki Lopez. You're Miami, right? Straight Miami?
Yes,
Straight 305. Okay.
Yes.
She is telling us now, we're back with her. She's just found out her sentence has been commuted. She's got a commutation from President Clinton. Okay, Vicki, that's all yours.
So as I say to you, I'm whisked. That now we have all of this, like, oh my God, she's got to go. I didn't realize they'd booked me on the 9:20 flight out of Orlando, and now I'm 50 miles from the Orlando airport. I now understand all of the craziness that is going on in the compound.
Right, the whispers and whatever, yeah.
But what's really interesting is that the correctional officer comes in and says to her, listen, there's a lot of unrest. They're worried. And she said, tell them that if they don't behave, I will lock down the compound. And I said, Miss Cuffey, just tell them I'm going home. And she said, I will do no such thing.
Wow.
But by this point, see, because again, God, it's all over this story. My friend had already called her husband had called my husband, and my husband told them I was going home.
Okay.
So they knew I was coming home. They knew. So as I'm leaving, now mind you, I haven't been in a car for 15 and a half months. I've been inside for 15 and a half months. I get thrown into this and I'm hanging out. It's like something out of a movie. I'm hanging out of the window of this pickup truck that's going to take me to the airport. And I would say of the 499 women, 400 of them are in the little patio, the visitation patio.
Oh.
I can see them, and they're one on top of the other, and all yelling, Vicki, don't forget us.
Oh.
It was a mandate.
Wow.
The screams and me screaming to them, because they never gave me the opportunity to go back inside and say goodbye to people who'd become part of my family.
Right.
To this day,
you live with them. I mean, you're living together. You're spending all your time together. You're working with them.
Correct. So I was whisked away from the world I knew, like that, not given the opportunity to say goodbye.
That's effed up. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it. That's effed up.
It was so sad, because if you know me, you know how affectionate I am and how I'm always hugging people and how I genuinely love the human connection. So they took that from me, but God had a different plan about that. And so I whisked off, and then I land in Miami. Listen, it's so, you just are in a whirlwind. And my husband, to his credit, wanted to make sure that when I got home, it was late already. It was 11ish, way past my bedtime, my prison bedtime, because remember, it lights out at 10.
Right.
And I just realized that in that moment, life had gone on without me. And I was having a sort of an experience where I'm in this restaurant that they've kept open. Everybody's there, and I'm not there. My body's there, but I'm not there, because it's too much.
Right.
Not only is it too much, now I don't see them the same. It's hard to come home and see everybody the way you saw them when you left. And it was so hard for me, because I was like, wow, I kept saying to myself, wow, they're moving rather quickly. Their conversations are null and void in my book. They're talking about things I don't care about. So I'm having a conversation with myself while my body's in
your head. Yeah.
I couldn't wait to get home.
It was a lot.
I will tell you this, 15 and a half months doesn't seem like a long time. Especially when I tell you that I'm comparing it to the sentences of my friends who had 10, 12, and 15 years, right? But when I woke up that morning in my own home, I went into the closet and there was dust on on the shoulders of my clothes because,
Right.
no one had
They've
gone into
been
my
hanging
closet.
there, right?
So I realized I'd been gone a long time, a long time. Then the task in my head was, now what? Now what? Now I'm home. And
What's my
I was,
purpose?
yeah, like, okay, what? So it took me a couple of months to settle in. Took me a couple of months. I remember going to the grocery store and running into my prison mom. And it was so emotional for me that I left the groceries in the cart, drove home, and went right to bed, just as I had when I would have visitations.
Oh, wow.
I remember thinking, wow, I'm probably suffering a little bit of PTSD, trying to hold it all together. You think that you've made it, right? You get home, you think you've made it, then you realize, no, actually it can't go away. It doesn't go away. And the funny part about it is, people wanted me to forget about it, like you sort of scratch it all off. And I that would make me so angry when people would say, Vicki, you're home, forget about what happened. And I would say to them, listen, you know what, you you don't really understand what I've been through, and you don't forget where you've been. And I had like this always this sense of mission, like I was mission driven, but I didn't know what the mission was. And I started working with girls in detention, to be honest with you, through the Junior League, believe it or not. The Junior League of Miami, who is a group of women who train volunteers, had become what I thought to be very edgy, because they had, instead of doing,
Right. Instead
well, yeah, and I
of
thought, oh,
white elephant sales, they were doing.
they were going into detention to try to help young girls, steer away from what might be a life that I had just left, right? And so I decided that that was going to be the work I was going to do, and it was so meaningful to be able to see these young girls and to attempt to turn their lives around, right? So I started doing that I came home on November 21st of 2000. I probably did that for a good 3 years. And then, because, if you wait on God, it's amazing. I tell anybody who's listening, look at, God's got a plan and you got to just wait on him. Wouldn't you know it, that George W. Bush, in his State of the Union address in 2004, decides to put an inmate in the gallery next to the First Lady. His name is Julio Medina. And in the speech, when he introduces him, he says, when the gates of prison open, it should lead to a better life. And he pointed to Julio Medina up there in that gallery. And I thought, what? Like, okay, no one saw that coming. And that was January, obviously, State of the Union. By April, his brother, who was then our governor, Governor Jeb Bush, creates the ex-offender task force, the governor's ex-offender task force. And he gave it his name, governor, because obviously that governors create task forces all the time, but when they throw governor in front of it, it's super important. And I read about it in the paper. And I told my husband at the time, I said, oh my God. And we knew Jeb, obviously, right? We're good Republicans. We've
Right.
always been supporters of the Bush family. He reached out to Jeb and he said, Vicki would love to serve. And I applied to serve. And I was appointed to that task force. And that's when I knew, oh, here we go. I'd spent 3 years doing detention work, juvenile work, right? In particular, looking at the gender specific needs of a young girl, what drives her into the system, et cetera. But that was all. There was not a wasted moment there when I start doing this work, because it all starts there. It all starts in the juveniles, like what's happening in their lives. What is the trajectory into an adult prison? And at the time, the Annie Casey Foundation was funding the work. And why did they come to Florida? Well, first of all, because they're Republicans. It's the UPS family. And one of the members of the UPS board is a strong Republican and knew that had heard that, Jeb was going to create this task force. And the interesting part is, the Annie E. Casey Foundation is the preeminent children's foundation in our country.
Mm-hmm.
It had begun to do a sort of an initiative in 16 communities called Strengthening Families or Strengthening Communities. And what they found was that they couldn't strengthen any community because most of the people in the communities they had selected had been to prison. And so they realized, okay, wait, there's a problem in America. And so they helped fund our work. And lo and behold, the chairman, so I was elected the vice chairman. So mind you, we now have a Republican convicted felon leading the work in Florida because the chairman decides to leave the task force. He had some other work that needed to be done. And Jeb elevates me to chair the entire work. So for 2 years, and this is when I find myself meeting you, Dara.
That's right.
I start doing this work in 2004, and Jeb left office in 2006, January of 2006. The work continued. Unfortunately, it did not continue under Governor Chris. He did not have, despite the Casey Foundation's offer to continue to fund the work, he thought it was better suited in the Department of Corrections. And there I began working with Secretary McNeil at the time, who seated another reentry task force, which I chaired under his direction. And I continued to do that work until 2010. And then in 2010, I began working with the Pew Charitable Trust on restorative justice issues. So I started doing some real, what I called deep policy work around criminal justice reform. And around that era, being a conservative, I'm a fiscal conservative, and I simply hate spending money or wasting it. And the Texas Public Policy Foundation had begun this movement called Right on Crime, where conservatives have all gotten together at that time and said, look, we're spending way too much money on prisons, and the return on the investment is poor. People are not coming out better prepared. They're committing new crimes. We've got new victims, so the communities aren't safe. So they write this statement of principles on the Right on Crime, and they bring it to Florida. And I remember I was one of the early signatories of that, which really said, look, we've heard hard on crime and soft on crime. Let's try being right on crime. And I thought it was a nice twist on the right? Because, as conservatives, we're on the right side. But it was really right on crime. We needed to get it right. And that's really where my work, I think, took off on a national level. We completed our report in 2006. Governor Bush also issued another executive order to look at employment restrictions, because what we found was that people couldn't get back to work. And if you don't work, you're going to commit another crime. I mean, it's just that simple.
They're still working on that.
Yeah, still working on that. But we were able to decouple getting your civil rights restored.
Right.
Remember that? You couldn't, and only 54 people were getting their civil rights restored every year. So
and being able to be eligible for certain licenses,
public licensure,
so that you could have a job as a barber and things like that.
So we fixed that, right? We actually created exemption processes for people to go through. So, and you think your work is done, it's never done. It's never done, because you always find that there are other impediments or challenges that people are facing that we haven't addressed. Much of it deals with mental illness. The whole mental health crisis that we have in jails today, and also in prisons. I mean, there's not enough funding. So, who gets, and to the credit of this secretary, who I do have so much respect for, Secretary Ricky Dixon, he really understands the need for it. He just isn't given enough money to do it. So only the most severe cases of mental illness actually are addressed in our state prisons today. He understands and would love to ensure that everyone who has any mental illness would get funding to get services, but it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So he does what he can do with the little amount of money they give him, because I just recently toured one of the mental health units with him, and it's just, for me, it's so sad, because look, at mental illness is a range of mental illness, right? Like going into the system can make you feel like you need a little help, right? I mean, so everybody probably needs a little bit of assistance when you first go in, right? Because if you've been through, if you've been through what I've just described to you, trust me when I tell you, we all could use a little bit of it, right? And then there are those that come, with severe and persistent mental illness. Those are the ones getting the help that they need, right? They're in the wrong place. They shouldn't be in a correctional institution. They need to be in a mental institution. But we don't have those, right? So it's difficult to get them the help that they need. In my own county jail, 67% of the inmates in my county jail today have a mental illness. I mean, so so I tell you all of this because there's just so much work to be done. But I started to do this work, and I wore my conviction on my sleeve as a badge of honor because I had a lot of street cred inside. Like, listen, when I speak and I say to people, you hear all these accolades about me that this presenter's just said. Listen, let's cut to the chase. I'm inmate 14246-018. You can hear a pin drop right about that moment, but it's important. It's an important moment because the late Jim Keem, who I had so much respect for, our senator, he said, if it can happen to Vicki, it can happen to anybody. When I would testify before the criminal justice committees, now wearing this incredible hat of Governor Bush, people took notice. And I think it was important because I don't look or fit the profile of who we think goes to prison. So who better to tell the story than the one who can and insists on giving voice to those whose voices have been silenced.
Wow. Well, you just told us an incredible story, and I'm very, very few times am I at a loss for words, but I am right now because you are an amazing person. You have helped so many people inside and outside. You personally helped a close relative of mine. We're very grateful for your just having someone to talk to who knows what's what when you are incarcerated makes such a difference. Now you're a state representative. What made you decide to bring your skills to the legislature?
Well, the story didn't end there. Obviously, that years later, as I'm doing this work, I was trying to get a presidential pardon.
That's right.
And
I
at the
skipped
same
over
time,
that because you wouldn't be able,
time,
just with the commutation, you would not be eligible to
run.
Correct. Right.
Correct. And during that period of time, I did get my civil rights restored. Governor Bush and his cabinet that was a very emotional day for me because I took it very seriously. My right to vote, my right to run for elected office. What I didn't have was the right to carry, which I now have because, so there were, as I said, I wore that badge very honorably. I said, what? Bad things happen to good people, and they will not be defined by what happened, but by what they do with what happened. And that's been my mantra ever since. And so I went along my merry way. And then the U.S. Supreme Court took certiorari on not one, but 3 honest services fraud cases. Sir Conrad Black, a Canadian publisher, Alaska State Senator Alan Wyroth, and everyone remembers the Enron case, Jeffrey Skillings, the CEO. So all 3 of them had been convicted of honest services fraud. And Antoine Scalia, the late, I always loved this Supreme Court justice. I never knew why I was going to love him so much. He's the one who wrote the opinion that said you cannot have been found guilty of honest services fraud if you were not found guilty of the underlying charge, which immediately caught my attention because my case would have been the poster child case. And so then now what do you do? Right now you're finished serving your sentence, you've done your probation, which is another thing we skipped over, but boy, oh boy, is that an interesting story in and of itself. You see, because God didn't say, I forgot to check the little check on the commutation application that said I also wanted my probation commuted. But God had a plan there as well, because he said, no, you got to go through the whole system, Vicki. You can't skip a piece of it, because if you do, your story, you'll screw up my plan. So I didn't know what my legal recourse was. So we called our lawyers, and they said, well, there's a very old, it's called the coram nobis action that you can take, which is what happens to a defendant after all of their, they're done serving their sentence, they're done. How do you get justice? Well, through this. So we contacted the prosecutor, and he joined me in district court in the Middle District, and the judge issued an order on February 14th of 2011 that said that I had been convicted of a non-existent crime.
Valentine's Day.
Yes, it was. I'll never forget it. That in fact I'd been wrongfully convicted, and then obviously wrongfully incarcerated. So here I was. Now, anybody else would have been thrilled. I got to tell you something. I had mixed emotions, and I know that sounds crazy. And that Sunday, that was a Friday. That Sunday, I went to Wakulla State Prison to as it was my practice. Wakulla was a faith-based prison, mm-hmm. and I would go in to service. I liked to go in and attend church services. I went that day and I cried. And the men that were in church service that day thought, oh God, something terrible must have happened to Vicki. I was in the back row, and they could hear me, and I was just not happy. And after the service, they came up to me and they said, Vicki, oh my God, what's happening? And I said, oh my God, you guys, my conviction got vacated. And they were like, they didn't know what that meant. And I said, okay, so like a judge erased it, said I'd been wrongfully convicted of a non-existent crime. And they were like, wait, why are you sad? And I said, because I feel like I've lost my street cred with you. And they said, listen up, girlfriend. One day in prison, what you have been through, no one takes that from you.
Yeah.
Because I thought, well, I have the same credibility that I have when I go to speak to thousands of inmates about changing their lives, about coming out and being better men and women. And they were just like,
isn't it funny how our minds work?
And that allowed me then, as you can imagine, a whole new realm of possibilities, right? Then people stopped. I don't know that people really understood what it meant, a conviction being vacated. But then I was no longer a convicted felon. Then I was just, oh my God, a victim of terrific injustice, right? Then you look at the whole story and you go, oh my God, this poor woman. But I don't like to see myself as a victim. I like to see myself as someone who's actually gone through a particular situation, which was preordained for me, because God has said, you're going to do big work, Vicki, but big work requires, let me tell you something. I like to quote scripture sometimes when it's appropriate, and here it is appropriate. To whomsoever much is given, much will be required. And that is what drove me, because I did have the ability to make a difference. I could either take the Martha Stewart approach and just go back to living my life and being happy that I'm no longer, in the system, or I could say to myself, Vicki, there's got to be something you continue to do and say. And so I continued that work. And then it's interesting. Then there was like another hiatus of work, right? Like, that work sort of dried up for me. And then I started doing other work, like, work that intersected with it, like education, affordable housing, employment, workforce development, right? Because I could see, like, if I could inch my way into the arenas that also intersect with criminal justice, I might be able to do interesting work there. And I was able to do it when I went to work for an affordable housing company, an expert in DC. I was excited to be able to use, because she had created affordable housing communities, and many of the people in those communities had actually been to prison. So I could do some more work, right? Bringing in more services to those communities to help those people get on with their lives. So I found ways in which to do it. And then slowly but surely, the story went away, Dara, in a very strange way. It just dissipated until I ran for office.
We'll be back with State Representative Vicki Lopez.
From the team that brought you Deeper Dive with Dara comes a brand new e-newsletter on the Florida man who may be president. Governor Ron DeSantis is his own conservative brand, an unapologetic culture warrior who could run for the White House as early as 2024. The DeSantis Files is your one-stop shop for the best in reporting, analysis, and opinion on the man supporters call America's governor. Delivered straight to your inbox twice a week. Learn more by emailing editor@cityandstatefl.com. That's cityandstatefl.com. Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara.
So, Dara, as I said to you over the years, the sort of story and the work went away, right? And I started getting very involved in the Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, started serving on their board. It was sort of reinventing myself. I left Tallahassee after, many, many years doing work here. And so I started to do what I thought was the kind of work I love anyway, which is economic development, getting people back to work. And then I guess it was 2021 when there was a Senate seat that opened up because Senator Annette Taddeo was vacating it to run for governor. And I honestly never thought I would run for office again. I mean, absolutely would tell people that you're crazy if you think I would ever do that. And it's funny that it was the vice president of government affairs at the time of the chamber who said, I think you'd be perfect. You should run. Because I was doing a lot of government affairs work in the chamber, kind of promoting the business agenda, which in Miami includes things like resilience, education, workforce. I mean, the things that really drive me, workforce, housing. And I said, listen, I'll consider it, but, not really seriously. And at the time, it was a seat out west. And I live in Brickell, so I would have had to have moved. And at the time, Representative Fernandez Barquin was looking at that seat as well. And at some juncture, he let me know that he was going to run for that seat. And it was during redistricting. So I said, of course, no worries, I'm old school. I sort of know not to create a primary with someone who's a senior member of the House, et cetera. So I kind of left that alone. That was probably June of 2021. And then the maps came out and they moved that seat all the way to the east, which was really interesting. And it included I guess it would be a good 7 or 8 blocks where I live on Brickell. It's just a small little tiny indentation they did. And so I thought it was a sign that I should run. And so I filed to run for that Senate seat in April, at end of March, early April of 2022. And, at the time, there was another candidate in the race as well. And that candidate jumped to a House seat, leaving the field clear and open for me. And then there was a sort of kind of a change of destiny, I guess you would call it. Because then the Senate leadership decided on another candidate that they were going to back. And so, I'm smart enough to know that when there is that kind of backing of another candidate, that I probably would not stand a really good chance. So I literally looked at another seat. I said, well, and I really was at some point, I think I said, what are my options? And somebody said, there's this open seat in your district where you live in the House. And I said, but that seat is I think at the time it was a D+5 or 6 seat. And I thought to myself, even though I'm a moderate Republican, known in these circles as a center right Republican, I didn't know whether that was an option that was really viable. So I wasn't sure, Dara, the sort of no party affiliated, that sort of very large group, practically 40%. I said, maybe they're in the center. Who knows? Maybe they've left both parties because they're more moderate. Maybe they're fiscal conservatives like I am, but they're less government. I've been a lifelong Republican because I like less government in my life and in businesses, et cetera. So I decided to jump into that seat. And it's funny, a lot of people tried to tell me not to run for office because they said that my past would creep back into my present. And after years of having rebuilt my life, I gave that a lot of thought. I said, is this something that I want to have to live through again? Because it never goes away. I think my story, like everyone else's story is, it only takes but a minute to Google me to know what my story is, right? And I had successfully built a career that did not include that story anymore. And so the question was, do you have what it takes to stomach having to talk about it again? And I said, yeah, I do, because it's my story. And because it has a happy ending, right? Because my conviction was vacated, because justice, finally did prevail in the end, I thought it was a good story to tell, right? And you know me over the years, I've told my story over and over and over again. So it isn't like my story was a secret. It isn't like everyone, certainly in politics, didn't know it. I think a lot of people during that era, and since then, because of the work I did here in Tallahassee in criminal justice reform, knew the story. So I said, all I have to do is convince my voters that it was in fact an injustice, that I have gone on to do great things gratefully as a result of that experience. So, sure enough, it didn't take long for the story to surface, but it didn't surface truthfully. So my Republican opponent in my primary distorted the truth, said that I had this very close relationship with the Clintons. I met the president once after he left office at a book signing. I had no relationship with the Clintons, and yet, the Republican sort of far right story was Vicki's really tied to these Clinton people and the Democrats, and
very harmful in a GOP primary.
Well, it was, but there was no evidence to reflect that, right? And I've always taken the high road. I just simply said, I'll let voters decide for themselves. In my district, I think they're pretty smart, and I suspect they'll do their own research. And so I beat my Republican primary opponent handsomely. 2/3 of the vote came to me in that primary. But that sort of allowed the story to, kind of take hold. And I think what was most hurtful was the Democrats' approach to trying to use my story against me. If there's been anyone who's been mostly impacted by these stories, are usually Democrat voters, right? People who are have been marginalized, and the Democrats have always been sort of the champion of people that go to prison and come home. And of course, I've changed that narrative over the years with the Right on Crime movement. It's been, we all are concerned for different reasons, but we're all concerned. And so when the Florida Democratic Party decided to tell my story, they weren't honest at all about it. And I heard from so many people who had come home from prison saying how disturbing it was for their party, because they were open about being Democrats, about how their party was actually distorting the truth. And what did that say to the many hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have come home from prison? Because the narrative was I was corrupt to the core. Mind you, there's no way anyone could make a mistake about what happened in my case. It's too high profile. It's too well known for anyone to feign that they didn't know the outcome. The outcome's pretty much all over the press. So the fact that they actually knew the truth and distorted it by trying to make me look like I was somewhat of a corrupt politician And this went on for weeks. Even though we informed them, you all know that that's not the truth. You need to withdraw any kind of inference that somehow I'm a corrupt politician or was a corrupt politician when you know that not to be the truth. And they created a website. They sent numerous texts to my district. And, it's funny that I those were some very difficult moments because one, I'd spent practically my entire public policy work trying to change the narrative about people who come home from prison, right? That they're not who they were when they went in, they're different, that they shouldn't be judged by their crimes. And here I was being judged not by my crime because it had been found that I had been found guilty of a non-existent crime, but by the very party that always champions this work. And it was really very telling that they would not only not tell my story accurately, they would actually be the ones who were corrupt in telling the story differently.
And so now you won your election.
I sure did.
And so now what is it like to be working with those folks? I mean, you're in the chamber with them, you're in the majority, you're in the super majority.
I am.
So I know redemption and forgiveness is a big part of the redemption journey. So how is it for you to be in the chamber working with them now?
It's wonderful because I look at what occurred as somewhat of my own redemption tour. Had that story not come out the way it did, it helped me heal my own story, right? Because everyone who has this story in different ways fears that story coming out, right? Mm-hmm. That so many people walk around sort of hunched over, hoping that no one hears about their story. And when it got out there, first of all, it allowed me to tell my story correctly, right? Which, is part of the process, part of the healing process is to tell your story. And look I've been famous for saying, if you tell your story, you free others to tell theirs. Mm-hmm. Because everybody's walking around thinking, oh gosh, I don't know how to tell that story. Just tell the truth. Tell what happened is what I tell people, right? So they gave me an opportunity to put it to bed once and for all. They really did. And for that, I am eternally grateful. I really am, because I had to confront my own fears, confront the lies and the sort of false narratives that people had. And I was able to come through it and win my election despite every effort they made to try to paint me as someone who I am not. That now it's easy because, again, remember that I am really about forgiveness and redemption. I really, really am. I've lived my life like that. So when I'm in the chamber with them, it's interesting. I don't blame any one person, right? Because, the party is the party, and I don't know who you would look at other than potentially the leader of that party. But even so, it makes no sense to me to continue to harp on a story that is over now, thanks to them. It's kind of interesting. They played an important part in ensuring that we put that story to bed.
Accidentally. So now you're in the House. Republicans have a supermajority in both chambers, firm grip on power. I'm wondering, is the criminal justice reform, is that on the back burner for you? Is that part of your agenda as a state legislator, or are you more focused on ancillary? When I say ancillary, I'm thinking housing, workforce, education. Those things are all, as you say, they're intersected with criminal justice system. But what are your goals as a legislator?
So it's interesting that it's almost as if the whole world put that story to bed, because I would have expected, with my experience in criminal justice, and both here in the state and nationwide, that I might be that voice, right? that emerges as here she is now, having done public policy work for so many years, that she would somehow take that mantle, right? But what happened was I didn't get on any of those committees. And I think that might be by design, Dara, that in fact the story is over, but it doesn't mean that it's over for me, right? So it may be from, I guess I would say maybe from my party's perspective, it's over, right? Or from everybody's perspective, it's over. Look, I mean, who could have thought after the attacks I came under, false attacks, that I would be where I'm at today? And I think that speaks much greater than anything else that I'll ever do, because I have been told time and time again by those who have been either in prison or coming home from prison or are already home from prison, that my getting elected is the biggest hope that they've ever had. And that means that I've overcome that story, and that they too think they can overcome theirs, which is so moving for me, because they see my place here now as, oh my God, if she can get elected after all that she's been through, then I can certainly move on in my life. And that's what I do a lot of. I still do a lot of speaking to groups, particularly those who have returned home, to inspire them to get over the challenges, right? I mean, there's no greater challenge than being on the front page of the paper or in mailers or on TV and people saying lies about you, right? And yet here I am. And so it speaks to it. And I'm hopeful that in the coming years, I will get more involved. Like, for instance, I would like very much, I joined ALEC, which is, a big public policy group. And I have joined I'd like to do some criminal justice work with them, because I did it when I was doing work under Governor Bush. They were very instrumental with some really good policy that they shared with us. So I don't know what the future holds, but I know that the story is not over for me. It seems over. It's weird. It's like a sense of, okay, well, it's done. But is it really? Because when I go into prisons to visit, as I did a month ago, it seemed still a part of me, and it's still very real. So I hope to do more of it. I hope to work more closely with the Department of Corrections. I was appointed to the Foundation on Correctional Excellence, which is a wonderful sort of initiative. I'm hopeful that I'll get a chance to do some really solid work. I think there's plenty still left to do. Just my sort of short visit to Wakulla reflected that. So I'm hopeful to start spending more time in that silo, and to really propel, what I think is true reentry, because we've got a long way to go, Dara. And hopefully my story and my ability to end my political career here in Tallahassee not only will help me get back onto that scene, if you will, but it will also help me give voice, as I said, to those things that I know still need to be done. And somehow I will have the authority and power to do so now as a state rep.
Well, State Rep Vicki Lopez from Miami, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your journey with us and our listeners today. And I hope that you'll come back and visit with us soon.
I hope to do so as well, Dara. I think that we have lots to talk about as we move forward. And I've always considered you a dear friend. And I'm really grateful that we have an opportunity to reconnect like this.
Thank you again.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is a podcast by City and State Florida, hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs LLC and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.